We would like to move on to our final conversation tonight. And we have two people that we will be having a conversation with. They are good friends of mine, and we are so excited to have both of them tonight with us. Peter Vumisa is a Zambian, but serving as a missionary in South Africa, and he coordinates Ebed-Melech Institute based in Pretoria, South Africa. I've known him for, gosh, a couple of decades, and it's been such a blessing. Dr. Yao Perby, as much, I've known him for close to 2 decades. He's a global CEO of the HUD Group and also director of Quiver, and he is passionately committed to missions mobilization with a fresh edge to help Africa fulfill its debt to the world, not to the Paris Club, not to the IMF, not to the World Bank. We owe the world the gospel. And these two gentlemen tonight will be helping us to understand or to unpack how do we accelerate mobilization across Africa so that Africa becomes a leading player in global mission. Let me start with Dr. Perby. Give us a little bit of your context in just a minute or two. How did you move from being a trained medical doctor in Accra, Ghana, to becoming a missions mobilizer?
Well, thank you for inviting me to be here, Mark, and everyone else, Ferdinand, the whole team. How did that happen? Well, God calls, and the signs were there.
We see you.
Sorry?
We seem to be having some sound from where, I don't know. Femi, could you help us mute everyone?
Can you possibly turn on your video if it's convenient?
His video is on.
No, that's Dr. Vumisa.
Oh, Peter Vumisa is having a challenge with video. I don't know if that has been sorted, but previously he had indicated that there was a challenge with his video. So we'll just be having a conversation with both of them, and then he will come in at some point. So sorry about that. Yao, please go ahead.
Yes, we were asking how did a medical doctor, end up in being a missions mobilizer? Well, because God calls. I mean, if you look through our scripture, he calls David from being a shepherd. He calls Peter from being a fisherman. You know, he calls various people to various things. And while in 2006, I think I was with you, Mark, at the Younger Leaders Gathering in Malaysia. I was very set on, I'm never going to leave Ghana, or at least I'll never leave Africa, blah, 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 because I was tired of seeing people go elsewhere for greener pastures. And in the Lausanne Global Leaders Gathering, Younger Leaders Gathering, I heard the Lord speak very clearly. He said, it's my word, and I send you where I want you. So that was the beginning of the breaking of this, I'm not going to go anywhere kind of thing. And then beginning of the year 2008, my wife and I were studying the scriptures when Genesis 12:1 literally jumped off the pages. Leave your country, your people, your father's household, and go to a land I will show you. And I remember telling my wife, honey, by the end of this year, we will not be in Ghana. What I did not know was that by June, God will kick me out to Côte d'Ivoire, first to work as a missionary with the United Nations. Because whatever God asks us to do, we can be missional about it. Missional doctors, missional lawyers, missional shoemakers. So I went first to Côte d'Ivoire as a missionary, paid for by the United Nations. And then the year after, God called us to Canada, where we've been serving for the last 12 years until last year.
Wow. Wow. Thank you for that snapshot. I know the story is much longer, but because we don't have time. So before I go on to Peter Vumisa, give us your heart for Africa. You've recently co-authored a book titled From Africa to the Rest. Can you give us a synopsis, just a snapshot of what drove you to write that book and what you hope to accomplish by blessing Africa with such a powerful tool?
Well, thank you for asking. And so we've been on the mission field, globally, the last dozen years, seeing what God has done in almost 50 countries, but mainly based in Canada, seeing leading a Canadian mission organization as a Black man from Africa. And to our surprise, 2018 became the first year in which we've had more Christians in Africa than any other continent in the world. And I'm still traveling the world, and I had not heard this celebrated. So the first reason why we wrote the book, Samin Ngugi and myself, was to just celebrate what God has done. Look, we are sitting on this call today, and almost 100% of us are Africans, and we don't realize how strange that is. Because 100 years ago, we were condemned as the dark continent. In fact, 100 years ago, there were 4 Muslims to 1 Christian on the continent, and there were people who believed that the continent would be overrun by Islam. Right? I mean, to think that there was a mobilization conference in Edinburgh in 1910, and the theme was world evangelization in our generation, and yet there was no African invited. No African invited. There was one Black guy there. He did not even come from Africa. He came from the States, and he was not even registered. So to think that 110 years later, the story has totally changed, and Africa has the most Christians than any other continent. Number 1 has to be celebrated. And so Psalm 118 runs through the book. It is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. We give him all the glory that the stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. So that's one reason why we're excited and we wrote this book. We are celebrating what God has done. Because if we don't celebrate our story, man, nobody else is going to do it for us. When it's bad news from Africa, it's everywhere. When it's good news, nobody hears it. And so that proverb, until the lion learns to write his story, every tale of the hunt will glorify the hunter. And so now, and that's one of the key things in mobilization I'll talk about, the lions need to learn to write. And I love Ferdinand for that. We need to record, we need to do podcasts, YouTube, books, pamphlets. We've got to write the story of God through our African hands and eyes. And then the other reason why we wrote this is that, oh yes, the numbers are wonderful, but almost everywhere we go, we say that, oh yeah, Africa is the most numerically Christian continent. People ask, so what? Why is it not changing the continent? Why are you still poor? Why is there still this? Why is there still that? So we realized, my goodness, there are some problems that we need to handle. And so one of the reasons why we wrote this is to deepen our discipleship and make sure that our Christianity is no longer just 1 mile long and just an inch deep. We've got to do certain things because, it's deeply transformed people who can bring deep transformation of others. And so that's another reason why we wrote it. The last reason why we wrote this book, and we're passionate about this whole angle of mobilizing Africa, is that the projection, and if time will allow me, I can show you the graph. The projection is that although Africa is now the most Christian continent, and that by 2050, there'll be more Christians in Africa than the next 2 continents combined. Think about it. Yet the projection is that only about 10% or 12% of missionaries globally will be from Africa. And we're thinking that doesn't make sense. Either the projection is wrong. Yeah, exactly. Either the projection is wrong or the kind of Christianity is wrong. Because how can the most Christian continent produce so few senders of the gospel? All right. And so the part of what we do is mobilize the continent, saying, guys, it's our turn. Let's get up and get doing, because otherwise if it doesn't happen, it'll probably be the first time in history where a group of people have not utilized their Christian numerical strength for the federals of the kingdom. That will be the first time. And I hope it doesn't happen on your watch and on my watch.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Yao. As I move on to Peter, if you don't mind, could you just post a link on how we can get access to that book? You could put it in the chat and then maybe on Amazon or whatever. Peter Vumisa is joining us from South Africa. I'm coming back to you, Yao, so don't disappear. Peter is joining us from South Africa tonight, but he's had some issues with his video, like I mentioned earlier, so you would bear with us on that. But Peter leads a ministry called Ebed-Melech Institute, and I would like him to just explain why Ebed-Melech. Most people don't even know who Ebed-Melech is, and how does that contribute to the conversation on mobilization from Africa, and what is he seeking to see happen through the Ebed-Melech Institute? Peter?
Thank you, Mark. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, thank you very much. The problem I'm having here is that we have power outage. So I'm sitting in the dark, actually. I'm using the phone as a hotspot.
We understand.
So,
we're all in Africa.
Yes. Yeah, well, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share our story as well from the South. You asked why Ebed-Melech Institute. Well, when you follow the history of salvation, you see that Africa has been involved in God's plan of salvation right from the beginning. In fact, if you try to find out at what point did Africa begin to get involved in God's plan of salvation, you won't come up with a date, because God has been involved in Africa as long as we can remember. Now, Ebed-Melech is called Ebed-Melech the Cushite in the Bible, in the book of Jeremiah 38 and 39. He is the gentleman who helped Jeremiah when the prophet was persecuted by the politicians who did not want to hear that the Babylonians will come and overthrow Jerusalem. And therefore, the Jews were supposed, according to God's direction, they were supposed to submit to Nebuchadnezzar. Now, that was bad news for the Jews. And so they persecuted Jeremiah and they threw him in a pit. And an African by the name of Ebed-Melech the Cushite went and pleaded with the king that the prophet might die. And so the king gave him about 30 men to go and rescue him. And so the prophet was rescued. And when you look at what Ebed-Melech did at that moment, there is a lot that God accomplished through that act. Number one, God's voice was blocked by throwing the prophet in the pit. And so by the action of rescuing the prophet, what he was doing is defending the gospel so that the message can reach the people that needed to receive the message. And of course, eventually the king received the message. And then secondly, it is an indication that God is involving Africa in all what he does. You see, so for us to use the name Ebed-Melech is to remind ourselves that God has been at work in Africa as long as we can remember. And so people who say that Christianity is a white man's religion, I think that is misunderstanding history. And by the way, Ebed-Melech and Jeremiah are the only gentlemen who were not taken into exile because God said so. And so if you read in the history of the Jews, they have actually, what is the word now, mortalized Ebed-Melech. They've even gone to the extent of saying that Ebed-Melech went to heaven alive. He's very much part of the history of the Jews. And yet, as Africans, he's our brother. We know very little about Ebed-Melech. You see?
Yeah.
So this is how ignorant we are in the history of God's work in Africa.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. I'll be coming back to you shortly. When I read the book written by Yao and Sam, my eyes were opened as to how far back in history Africa has participated in the mission of God. We've always seen Africans as recipients of the gospel, but that book helped me to understand really that Africa has always been at the forefront of extending the gospel to other parts of the world. And let me shift to Yao. I see in your name there, your location is Canada. That's a combination of Ghana and Canada. And that's because you served as a missionary in Canada for about 10 years. Tell us how you think we can mobilize Africans? Because this session is called Accelerating Mobilization Across Africa. What role do Africans have to play in getting the gospel to the West? People talk about reverse mission, but now, are people like you, people like me, black faces, are we needed in the white man's land or not? Just share, give us a snapshot.
All right. So I really like the background that was just shared, and because it's important to know our history, because it's an impetus, right, for mobilization. I mean, why you will not have the guts, the passion to share a gospel you think belongs to the white man. You will not be convinced about it. So I think that's a very important part of this whole thing. Yes, throughout history, we see God moves in waves. We see that, throughout history, there have been multiple centers of sending. And I think that's very important that we realize that as we talk about mission, Africa as a mission field to mission force, if I the subtitle of our book, we say again, because this is not the first time it's happening. Then you don't know your history. You don't know that Africans actually shipped, missions in Europe, with the before the last few years, 400 years, the gospel came back with colonialism and slavery and all of that. So it's very important that we have here, because it's our impetus. We look at the world today, there are many, many places which actually need re-evangelization. I have an international student in my house right now from the US, and she's telling me that there are a bunch of them who came and that most of them don't even want anything to do with God. One of them says he's actually a pagan. He actually used the word pagan. It's very rare, that's the word that was being used for us 100 years ago. So if you should ask me, absolutely, the rest of the world needs the gospel from Africans. I'll tell you something that happened. At some point, living in Canada was burdensome, just leaving the children with somebody so that my wife and I can have a date. That meant, paying $15 an hour, that kind of thing. We're like, this won't happen in Africa. You just call her, sister, come, or auntie here, or go and give the person to your mother. So we were thinking about the comforts of being back home, so to speak. And as we thought about it, one young lady we were discipling, she had come to know the Lord in Montreal. The city of Montreal is a French city. And she had come from Colombia and come to know the Lord, and we were discipling her. So one day she says to us, you said that there are many Christians in Ghana. And I said, yes. At that time, I think Ghana was 69% Christian. It's now 71%, that's something like that. So she asked me, and I said, yes, that's true. And then she asked me, what is the percentage of Christians in Montreal, the city we're living in? And at that time, the statistics was that there's a lot of Catholicism, and there are Catholics who are truly saved. So I want to be careful about this. But in terms of evangelical Christians, the city of Montreal at that time had less than 1% evangelical Christians. Wow. So this young lady from Colombia, who had just come to know the Lord, was looking at me and asking me, are you serious that you want to return to the place that has 70% Christian when we have less than 1% Christian here today? I hope that answers that question. That is many places in the world. France is totally secularized right now, and not just secularized, being Islamicized. In fact, the Christians are so few and are also not given birth, in France and in Germany, that if the trend continues, by 2050, France and Germany will be Islamic republics, just by virtue of the reproduction of Muslims who are moved into France and Germany, and the secularization, which includes having few children. So my brothers and sisters, you're needed even in Europe. Not to mention the places in Europe and America that need re-evangelization, not to mention the places that have been unreached at all, like India. And so, for example, right now, China and India are among the top 3 countries with the most unreached people groups in the world. Guess what? they are among the top 2 countries Africans are sending a lot of students to, because there are a lot of scholarships. Now think about it. Do you think it's an accident that God will take the most atheistic country in the world, China, and this country comes to the most Christian continent in the world, Africa, and says, send your young people to us, those that send them to us, and we'll pay for their education? I mean, it is unthinkable for us to sit down as Africans and say, no, we're going, we must go. Except that, and that is part of the discussion we have, except that there's got to be an intentionality about the preparation, the envisioning and the equipping, like our brother Femi was talking about, so that we don't become missionaries who don't even know we are missionaries. And recently at Quiver, we did a survey of almost 120 African Christian international students, you know, and about half of them did not see themselves as missionaries. Half. And yet all of them knew, 80% of them knew that Africa is the most Christian continent in the world. And when we asked about, had anybody trained them, even cross-cultural training, not even missionary training, just cross-cultural training, the majority had no training whatsoever. About 80% of them had not even heard of perspectives or kairos. We had a lot of work to do. And these are our brightest and the best. So literally, the most atheistic country in the world, China, is asking the most Christian continent in the world, send us your young people, send us your bright people. And I think God has a sense of humor. We've got to be able to ride that way. We recently sent a young lady to India, you know, prayed for her, commissioned her, and sent her. And she's going as a student to the most difficult state in India, Uttar Pradesh, 240 million people, you know, largely lost. So, God is counting on us. I believe that just as God used an African as the last man to help Jesus to carry the cross, it was an African from Libya. I believe that God is counting on us as the last people he would use to finish this great work of the gospel.
Amen. Before I come to you with one last question, Peter, what do you see as the key to accelerating mobilization across Africa? I know that you do a lot of work, not only in South Africa, not only in Zambia, but majorly in the Southern African region, which has a huge Christian population statistically. Most countries in Southern Africa, countries like Botswana, like, Zimbabwe, Eswatini, Lesotho, Namibia, Angola would claim to be Christian majority. What are the keys to accelerating, missions mobilization? Peter.
Well, knowledge is the best key, knowledge.
Okay.
In 2012, we also launched a book called Evangelical Christian Missions, an African Perspective. The reason why we did that book is because we realized that there is a lot of ignorance among ourselves. Remember that some of these countries in Southern Africa became independent very late. And therefore, they have spent most of their time fighting for independence or fighting for freedom. So when you look at South Africa, which is very much divided between black and white, while the white church was busy doing missions, sending missionaries from South Africa to Zambia, to Malawi, and other places, you will see a lot of work which the white missionaries from South Africa did. And yet there is nothing you can point at which the black people, the Africans, did during the same period. Why? Because they were busy fighting for freedom. So they are behind, and we need to educate our people. I just came back from Namibia 2 weeks ago. I was in Namibia, and I have seen that majority of the people that are pastoring the most big churches in Namibia are foreigners, not Namibians. So that shows that the local people are very much behind. They are still struggling because of the things they went through. issues of identity, issues of inferiority complex, issues of dependency syndrome. And I think largely as Africans, we all suffer from that. So if we can educate ourselves and understand that, it's Christianity has been with us for a very long time. And also the gospel has been in Africa even before the missionary movement was born in Europe. Africans have been part and parcel of what has been happening. Let me just give you a brief history of what has been happening in Africa. History of missions in Africa begins right on the day of Pentecost. Now, I don't need to elaborate about what happened there, how many people groups or how many languages were represented from Africa. That is about approximately 30 AD. And then the conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8 also illustrates to the fact that God placed Africa as a very important and strategic point when it comes to missions. Because just imagine, God sends an angel to go and speak to Philip, who was busy in a revival, in a Samaritan revival. And then he gets him, and he says, go to the road that leads to, to Gaza. And then he finds the Ethiopian eunuch, and he talks to him about Jesus Christ. And that's this man comes into Africa, and the rest is history. How the gospel has been strong in Africa. And then Antioch, the great missionary sending church, you will find the characters like Simeon, called Niger or Lucius of Cyrene from Africa as part of the leadership. And then during the 6th centuries, the Christian faith spread throughout Egypt, Nubia, and the regions of North Africa, that is Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, as well as to Abyssinia, which is modern Ethiopia. And then evidence for a strong church in North Africa is found in the two very important historical men, theologians, namely Athanasius and Augustine. And then the Christian communities in North Africa were among the earliest in the world. But you see, because we are not aware of these things, when I was in Bible school, I learned missions only for 1 week. And yet I'm spending the rest of my life doing missions. Yes. Can you imagine?
Wow.
And it's now that I'm learning that, according to history, in the 4th century AD, the Ethiopian king, Azana, made Christianity the kingdom's official religion, and in the 7th century, from 640 to 708 AD, Christianity, of course, was affected by the advance of Islam, and we are still being affected by Islam. But Christianity survived in Egypt and in Abyssinia, which is Ethiopia, for two very important reasons. Number one, translation of the Bible in the local languages, and because the gospel reached the common people. And this is what we need to do. We've been talking about holistic discipleship. This is it. It has been happening, and we need to do it again.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Peter. I hate to interrupt you because I'm learning so much from you. I'm tempted to ask one other critical question, but I won't because of time. We ran out of time. The question I would have loved to ask, maybe I'll throw it out there so that we can be thinking over these things, and you can share your thoughts on the GGCN WhatsApp platform. The group link had been posted earlier. I think it should be posted again for those who may have joined late. The question is, where did we lose our missional drive? We won't answer it now because of time, but if Africa has been there from the very beginning, playing a leading role in pushing the gospel, at what point did we become a receiving continent? What happened? Who dropped the baton? Last question for Dr. Perby, and I will encourage you to just answer this in 1 minute. Tell us about the Send Africa conference and how that is supposed to contribute to the rapid mobilization of the African church to bless the world with the gospel.
All right. So a number of people have come together from the African diaspora and on the continent to set up the Send Africa Network. It was launched a couple of years ago, and we've had online summits, but in person in Ghana on the 2nd and 3rd of November, people are gathering from all over Africa and the diaspora to consider transforming African mission mobilization. Some things have got to change in the way we mobilize for mission. And so if possible, do join us in person in Ghana for us to talk about these things. The African diaspora is one of the keys in mission mobilization, not only in terms of numbers, but they send us $40 billion every year. I mean, if even a tithe of that, if half of that was for Christians and a tithe of that half, that would be $2 billion for missions. But as it goes to missions, that's even the money, not to mention the skills, etc. So please join Africans and Africans in the diaspora for the Send Africa. It's a network, it's not an organization. We all have our own organizations. Like Ferdinand said earlier on, the Great Commission is just too big for one person, one organization to do alone. And it's too important for us not to try to do it together. So please join us in Accra, 2nd November for Send Africa Summit.
Whoa. Thank you so much to our two gentlemen who have helped us to capture the heart of mobilization from the African continent, Dr. Yao Perby and Reverend Peter Vumisa. Thank you so much.